The sun was hanging high in the sky, beating down on the concrete pavement of the police academy training grounds. It was that kind of hot afternoons where the air feels heavy and sticky, making it hard to breathe. For the group of young recruits standing in formation, the heat was the least of their problems. The real problem was the sweat soaking through their uniforms and the shouting voices of the training instructors. But for one young man, the problem was much deeper than just the weather or the yelling. We will call him David. David was 22 years old, fresh out of college and filled with a sense of purpose that shone in his eyes. He had joined the force because he wanted to help people. He wanted to be the kind of police officer who walked into a neighborhood and made people feel safe instead of scared. He had a kind face and a tall, strong build, but there was a softness to him, a patience that made people want to talk to him, however. There was one thing that made David stand out from the rest of the group. Out of the 50 recruits in his class, he was the only black man. At first, he thought it wouldn't matter. He thought that if he worked hard, kept his head down, and did his job well, the color of his skin would become invisible. He thought the badge was the great equalizer. But as the weeks went by, the reality of the academy began to sink in. The other recruits seemed to gravitate toward each other in cliques, leaving him to eat lunch alone or study in his dorm room. It wasn't that everyone was mean, but there was a wall between him and them, a wall made of quiet, whispers and sideways glances. Then there were the 3 senior officers. Officers Rogers, Kowalski, and Bates were not officially their teachers, but they were always around the grounds. Rogers was the leader, a man with a thick neck and a permanent scowl, who seemed to enjoy power a little too much. Kowalski was his shadow, always laughing a bit too loud at jokes that weren't funny. And Bates was the quiet one, with eyes that always seemed to be looking for trouble. They didn't like the new changes in the world. They certainly didn't like seeing David walking around the academy with his head held high. On this particular Tuesday, the physical training had been brutal. They had spent hours running, doing push-ups in the dust and crawling through mud. The instructors finally dismissed them for a late lunch, and the group of recruits broke apart, tired and hungry. David walked toward the mess hall, his stomach growling. He was looking forward to a cold bottle of water and maybe a few minutes of silence to rest his legs. He took a shortcut around the back of the equipment, shed to avoid the dust cloud kicked up by the other recruits. As he turned the corner, the shadow of a large building fell over him. Suddenly, 3 figures stepped out from the narrow alleyway between the shed and the wall. David stopped short. It was Rogers, Kowalski, and Bates. Rogers leaned against the wall, chewing on a toothpick. He looked David up and down, his eyes lingering on David's name tag. "Where you going, rookie?" Rogers asked. His voice was low and gravelly. He didn't sound like he was asking a genuine question. "Just heading to lunch, sir," David answered politely. He knew better than to talk back to senior officers. He kept his hands at his sides and stood straight. "Lunch," Kowalski repeated, snickering. "He thinks he can just stroll off to lunch while the rest of the squad is doing area cleanup." David frowned. "The instructor dismissed us, sir. Everyone was told to go eat." Bates stepped forward then, blocking David's path. He was taller than the others and looked down at David with a cold expression. "Are you arguing with a senior officer, cadet?" "No, sir," David said quickly. "I'm just saying what we were told." Rogers pushed himself off the wall and walked closer. He stopped just inches from David's face. The smell of stale coffee and tobacco wafted off him. "See, around here, we have a little problem with discipline, especially with recruits who think they are smarter than everyone else. We don't like that." David felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew what this was. He had heard stories about these 3, rumors of hazing and cruel games played on recruits they didn't like. He had hoped to avoid it, but here it was. "I just want to do my job, sir," David said, his voice steady even though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Your job," Rogers laughed dryly. "Yeah, your job. Today your job is to learn a lesson about respect." Rogers nodded his head slightly, and in a split second, Kowalski and Bates grabbed David. They didn't give him a chance to react. They didn't read him his rights or explain what was happening. They just grabbed him by the arms and shoulders, twisting them behind his back roughly. "Hey, let go!" David shouted, surprised by the sudden violence. He instinctively tried to pull away, using his strength to shake them off. But there were 3 of them, and they were experienced. They weren't interested in a fair fight. Stop resisting, rookie. Bates barked in his ear, twisting David's arm higher. It hurt, and David gasped, forced to stop struggling to keep his shoulder from popping out of place. They dragged him around the side of the building. Out of sight of the main grounds, there was an old, rusty utility pole there, covered in peeling paint. It was in a blind spot where the security cameras couldn't reach. They shoved David against the pole, his face scraping against the rough metal. "Hold him still," Rogers ordered. Bates and Kowalski pressed David's chest against the pole, pinning his arms behind his back around it. David's breathing came in short, sharp bursts. He felt fear, real fear, for the first time in the academy. He realized that no one was coming to help him. If he screamed, they would just say he was out of control. Rogers reached into his belt pouch and pulled out a thick roll of heavy-duty gray duct tape. He ripped a piece off with a loud thwack that echoed in the small alley. "Please don't do this," David said, looking at them. "This isn't right. We are all on the same side." Rogers ignored him. He grabbed David's wrist and pulled it tight around the back of the pole. He wrapped the tape around David's wrist and the metal pole again and again. The tape was sticky and tight. It cut into David's skin. Then he grabbed the other wrist and pulled it around the other side, forcing David into a helpless crossed arm position. He taped that one tight, too. David pulled against the restraints, but it was useless. The tape was strong, and the pole was solid. He was stuck. He was tied to the pole like a piece of luggage they wanted to secure. Kowalski stepped back to admire their work. He laughed. "Look at that. He actually fits there." Rogers didn't laugh. He just stared at David with a mean look. "Maybe this will teach you to keep your eyes down and your mouth shut. You think you're special? You think you're better than us? Look at you now. You're just a joke, kid." Betts took out his phone. He held it up, snapping a picture of David tied to the pole. "Come on, smile for the camera," Bates taunted. "This is going to be a funny memory for us." David looked away, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him beg or cry. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, forcing the anger and humiliation down deep inside him. He told himself to breathe. He told himself this wouldn't last forever. But in that moment, tied to a dirty pole in the back of the academy, he felt very small. "All right, let's go get lunch," Rogers said finally, checking his watch. "I'm starving." They left him there. Just like that, they walked away, still laughing about something else, leaving David alone in the hot sun. The tape itched his wrists. His shoulders ached from being pulled back. The dust swirled around his feet. For the first 10 minutes, David struggled. He tried to wiggle his hands, tried to find a loose end of the tape, but Rogers had wrapped it too well. The more he moved, the tighter it seemed to get. Sweat dripped down his forehead and into his eyes, stinging them. He could hear the sounds of the academy in the distance, the shouting of other instructors. The rumble of cars, but it felt miles away. He felt a deep burning sense of injustice. These were men who were supposed to protect people, and here they were tying up their own recruit for fun. It was cruel. It was illegal. It was a betrayal of everything the uniform stood for. Eventually, David stopped struggling. It was wasting his energy. He stood as straight as he could against the pole, lifting his head up. He watched a small bird land on top of the shed, looking down at him. He took a deep breath of the hot air and made a silent promise to himself. He promised that he would not let this break him. He would not let these men turn him into a victim. He was going to survive this day, and he was going to make something of himself. He was going to become a police officer, no matter what they did. And deep down, a quiet voice in his head whispered that one day the tables would turn. He didn't know how, and he didn't know when, but he knew he wouldn't stay tied to this pole forever. He stood there, baking in the sun, waiting for someone to find him. But in his mind, he was already free. The midday sun was still beating down relentlessly, turning the air into a thick, suffocating blanket of heat. The sounds of the police academy, shouting instructors, marching boots, and the distant rumble of cars seemed to fade away, leaving David in a strange, painful silence. He was still tied to the rusty utility pole behind the equipment shed, his wrists throbbing where the gray tape dug into his skin. For the first few minutes, David had struggled. He had pulled and twisted, trying to find any weakness in the tape, but it was hopeless. Rogers had wrapped it too tight. Every time David moved, the tape bit deeper, and the rough metal of the pole scraped against his back. Eventually, he forced himself to stop. He realized that fighting against it was only wasting his energy and hurting his wrists more. He needed to be smart. He stood as still as he could, taking slow, deep breaths to try and calm the racing of his heart as he stood there. Sweat dripping down his face and soaking into his uniform, his mind began to race. He felt a burning sense of anger, hot and sharp, but underneath that anger was a cold, hard realization. This wasn't just a prank. This was a message. Rogers and his friends wanted to humiliate him. They wanted to remind him that, in their eyes, he didn't belong. They wanted him to feel small, terrified, and powerless. David closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the stinging sweat. He remembered the look in Rogers' eyes. It wasn't just anger, it was enjoyment. They had laughed while they tied him up. That was the part that stuck in his mind more than the pain. They enjoyed seeing him helpless. 10 minutes passed, or maybe it was 20. It was hard to tell time when you were stuck in one spot, uncomfortable and anxious. Then he heard footsteps crunching on the gravel. David opened his eyes and saw an older man walking toward him. It was the janitor, a quiet man named Mr. Henderson, who always kept to himself and seemed to see everything that happened at the academy. Mr. Henderson stopped a few feet away, his bucket of cleaning supplies forgotten on the ground. He looked at the tape, then at David's face. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" Because it was obvious that David was not okay. The old man just sighed, a sound of deep disappointment, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small pocket knife. "Hold still, son," Mr. Henderson mumbled softly. He gently sawed through the thick tape. It took a few seconds of effort before the tape snapped with a sharp sound. David's arms fell to his sides, and the rush of blood back into his hands felt like pins and needles. He stumbled forward, rubbing his wrists. The skin was red, raw, and marked with angry welts where the adhesive had pulled. "Thank you, David," whispered. His voice was raspy from the heat and the dryness in his throat. Mr. Henderson put his knife away and picked up his bucket. He looked at David with sad eyes. "You be careful, now. Some people here, they got rocks in their chests where their hearts should be. Don't give them what they want." With that, the janitor walked away, leaving David alone again. David stood there for a long moment, looking at his bruised wrists. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run to the captain's office and report exactly what happened. He wanted to see Rogers and his buddies kicked out of the academy and facing charges, but then the reality of the situation sank in. Who would believe him? Rogers was a senior officer with friends in high places. The captain and Rogers played golf together on weekends. If David walked in there, they would probably say he was lying, or worse, that he had overreacted to a simple training exercise. They might even call him a troublemaker. If he fought them now while he was just a recruit at the bottom of the ladder, they would crush him. They would make sure he never became a police officer at all. David felt a shift inside him. It was like a switch flipping. He decided right then and there that he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He wouldn't be the angry black man they expected him to be. He wouldn't be the victim. He took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from his face, and straightened his uniform. He ignored the pain in his wrists. He turned his back on the alleyway and the pole and walked back toward the main building. The cafeteria was noisy and crowded when David walked in. He grabbed a bottle of water and a sandwich, his hands trembling slightly, and sat down at a corner table. A few minutes later, Rogers walked in with Kowalski and Bates. They were laughing loudly, looking around the room. When Rogers saw David sitting there, clean and composed, a look of surprise flashed across his face. Rogers had expected to find David crying in the barracks or running to the nurse. Seeing David sitting there, acting like nothing had happened, threw him off balance. Rogers walked over to David's table, leaning over him, trying to intimidate him. "Enjoy your lunch, rookie." David looked up. He didn't look away. He didn't look down at his plate. He looked Rogers directly in the eye. His face was calm, almost bored. "The food is good today, sir. You should try the roast beef." Rogers blinked, confused. He didn't know how to react to someone who wasn't scared of him. After a moment, he grunted and walked away. David watched them go. He knew Rogers wasn't done, but David had won a small victory today. He hadn't let them see his pain. From that day on, David changed his approach. He became like a ghost in the machine. He did everything perfectly. He studied harder than anyone else. He was the first to arrive in the morning and the last to leave at night. During physical training, he pushed himself past his limits, running until his lungs burned, lifting until his muscles screamed. He was determined to be the best recruit in the class, not because he wanted praise, because he wanted to be untouchable. He also started a journal. Every night, in the safety of his dorm room, he wrote down everything that happened. He wrote about the duct tape incident. He recorded the dates, the times, and exactly what Rogers and his friends said. He took photos of his wrists, which were still bruised, and kept them hidden in a drawer. He knew this evidence might be useful one day, but he was in no rush to use it. He was playing the long game. Months went by and the bullying continued, but it became more subtle. They would exclude him from conversations, lose his paperwork, or give him the worst duties. But David took it all without complaint. He treated everyone with respect, even the people who hated him. This made some of the other recruits start to respect him. They saw that he was tough. They saw that he wouldn't break. Finally, graduation day arrived. The auditorium was filled with families in their Sunday best. There was a band playing, and the atmosphere was celebratory. David stood in the lineup with his class, his heart pounding with pride. When they called his name, he walked across the stage, his steps sharp and precise. He shook the hand of the chief of police and accepted his diploma. He graduated at the very top of his class. He had the highest scores in marksmanship, the highest scores in legal studies, and the highest scores in physical fitness. There was nothing they could say or do to take that away from him. He had earned it. After the ceremony, Rogers and his group were standing by the door, watching the new officers leave. As David walked past in his crisp new uniform, Rogers stepped in front of him again. "Good luck out there, kid," Rogers said, his voice dripping with fake kindness. "It's a dangerous world. You might get hurt." David stopped. He looked at Rogers, then at Kowalski and Bates. He smiled, a genuine, confident smile. "Thank you, Officer Rogers. I'm not worried. I plan on being around for a long time." David walked out of the academy doors into the bright sunlight. He didn't look back. He had survived the academy, but he knew his journey wasn't over. He was going to become a police officer, but he wasn't going to be just any officer. He was going to change things. He was going to climb high, higher than Rogers could ever imagine. He was going to a place where they couldn't touch him, and from there, he was going to make sure that what happened to him never happened to anyone else ever again. He got into his car and drove away, leaving the academy, the pole, and the bullies in the rearview mirror, but the memory remained, stored away, fueling the fire that would drive him for the rest of his life. 5 years had a way of changing people, and David was no exception. The young man who once anxiously straightened his tie before a shift was now a figure of composed authority. He stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window in a sleek office building downtown, looking out over the city. The view was different from here, higher, clearer, more peaceful than the view from a patrol car. Working for the Department of Justice suited him. It was a world of sharp suits, high-stakes meetings and thick case files rather than noise, sirens, and streetlights. David had worked hard to get here. After leaving the academy, he had spent 2 years on the force, doing his job with a quiet excellence that made it impossible for his superiors to ignore him. But he knew he couldn't stay in that precinct. The environment was toxic, and the memory of the utility pole still haunted the hallways of that station, so he applied for a federal position. He wanted to be part of the Internal Affairs Division, specifically the sector that dealt with civil rights violations and police corruption. It wasn't a popular job among officers, who often saw federal investigators as the enemy, but for David, it was a calling. He wanted to clean up the mess from the inside. He wanted to be the person who stepped in when the system failed. Over the past 3 years in the federal office, David had built a reputation for being unshakable. He was known as the guy who didn't miss a detail. He could spend hours staring at spreadsheets and bank records, finding the hidden connections that other people overlooked. He was fair, too. He didn't go after people just because he didn't like them. He went after the facts. This integrity had earned him the respect of his bosses and the fear of those who had something to hide. One rainy Tuesday morning, David was called into the director's office. The director was a stern woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She didn't waste time with small talk. "David," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "We have a situation in your old district." David felt a familiar twitch in his chest. "District 4, ma'am?" "The same one," she replied, sliding a thick file folder across her massive mahogany desk. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has been receiving complaints for years, but lately it's become a flood. Excessive force, falsified reports, intimidation of witnesses. The corruption appears to be systemic, starting from the sergeants and trickling down." David opened the file. The first thing he saw was a photo of the precinct captain shaking hands with a local politician. Next to it was a chart showing a spike in lawsuits against the department. As he flipped through the pages, names jumped out at him. Reports signed by Sergeant Rogers. Witness statements accusing Officer Kowalski of roughing up teenagers. Use of force forms filled out by officer. Bets that didn't match the medical records of the people they arrested. David kept his face neutral, but inside his heart began to beat faster. He recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same arrogance he had seen 5 years ago. They hadn't changed. They had just become more powerful. Because no one had stopped them, they had grown bolder. They thought they owned the streets and that no rules applied to them. "Who is leading the task force?" David asked, his voice steady. The director looked at him intensely. "I want you to do it." David blinked, surprised. "Me. But I have a history there, ma'am. It might be seen as a conflict of interest." "On the contrary," she said, leaning forward. "You know that precinct better than anyone. You know the culture, you know the layout, and you know the players. We need someone who can walk in there and not be fooled by their lies. We need someone who has a personal stake in seeing justice done, but who is professional enough to keep their emotions in check. You spent years proving you are that man, David." David looked back at the file. He saw a surveillance photo of Rogers standing outside a donut shop, laughing. He looked older, heavier, but he still had that same look of entitlement. David thought about the hot sun, the duct tape, and the feeling of helplessness. He had promised himself he would never be that person again. But more than that, he had promised to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. "I accept," David said quietly. "When do I start?" "Monday," the director said. "You have full authority to audit their operations, interview officers, and make recommendations for terminations or indictments. We are going to clean house, David. I want you to tear it down to the studs if you have to." David left the office with the file under his arm. Over the weekend, he didn't go out. He didn't celebrate. He sat at his dining room table and read every page of the file. He memorized the dates, the names of the victims, and the specific allegations. He wanted to be prepared. He knew that Rogers and the others would try to charm him, threaten him, or trick him. They would use every dirty trick in the book to hold on to their power. But they didn't know who was coming. They probably didn't even remember his name. To them, he was just a rookie from years ago, a face in the crowd. They had no idea that the quiet young man they tied to a pole was now coming back as the one person in the world they couldn't afford to mess with. On Monday morning, David got dressed. He put on a crisp white shirt and a dark blue tie. He looked in the mirror and saw a man who commanded respect. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but the badge on his belt held more weight than any police chief's bar. He grabbed his briefcase, got into his car, and began the drive across the city to District 4. The drive felt surreal. He passed the same landmarks he used to see every day. The old grocery store, the park where he used to eat lunch, the high school football field. Everything looked smaller than he remembered. As he got closer to the precinct station, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. The building was a large, brick structure, with a big sign out front, Precinct 4, to serve and protect. David pulled into the visitors' parking lot. He sat in his car for a moment, taking a deep breath. He checked his reflection one last time. He wasn't going in there angry. He was going in there to do a job. Anger made people sloppy, and David was never sloppy. He was going to be precise, professional, and relentless. He stepped out of the car, the cool morning air hitting his face. As he walked toward the entrance, a patrol car pulled out. The two officers inside didn't even look at him. They just saw a man in a suit. They had no idea that their world was about to be turned upside down. David walked up the steps, his footsteps echoing on the concrete. He reached for the door handle and pulled it open. The smell hit him instantly, a mix of old coffee, floor wax, and paperwork. It was the smell of 1,000 police stations, a smell that used to make him feel anxious. Today, it just made him focus. He walked past the front desk, where a uniformed officer was sitting. "Can I help you, sir?" the officer asked, looking up from his computer. David opened his badge wallet and showed him his credentials. The officer's eyes went wide when he saw the federal seal. "I'm here to see the captain," David said, his voice calm but firm, "and inform the senior command staff that the federal audit is starting immediately." The officer stammered, Yes, sir. Right away, sir." David walked toward the inner offices. He could hear the buzz of the station phones ringing, typists clacking, radios crackling. He walked down the long hallway, his shoes clicking on the floor. He passed the break room. He passed the evidence locker. He was getting closer to the captain's office, just before he turned the corner to the main command area. He saw 3 men standing by the water cooler. They were in uniform, laughing and shoving each other playfully. It was Rogers, Kowalski, and Bates. David slowed his pace. He watched them for a second. Rogers had put on weight, his uniform straining at the buttons. Kowalski was balding now, and Bates looked tired. They were joking about something, completely at ease. They were the kings of this castle, or so they thought. David didn't stop. He didn't say hello. He walked right past them, his eyes fixed straight ahead. A sudden draft seemed to make Rogers shiver. The sergeant looked up, frowning, as the man in the suit walked by. There was something familiar about him, something in the way he carried himself, but Rogers couldn't place it. He just watched the stranger walk toward the captain's door, not knowing that his past had just caught up with him. David knocked on the captain's door 3 times, sharp and loud. "Come in." A voice boomed from inside. David turned the handle and stepped inside, closing the door on the past and opening the door to his future. It was time to go to work. The atmosphere inside the station was thick, like the air before a heavy thunderstorm. It was the middle of the afternoon, but the usual noise of the precinct, the ringing phones, the banter between officers, the clacking of keyboards, had died down to a nervous hum. The captain had called a mandatory assembly of all uniformed personnel and detectives. Everyone was required to be in the main briefing room, seated and waiting. By 2 p.m. sharp, Rogers walked into the room with his usual swagger. He had spent the last 5 years climbing the ranks, using intimidation and favors to get his way. Now, as a sergeant, he felt untouchable. He sat in the front row, leaning back in his chair, his legs spread wide. Kowalski and Bates flanked him, looking bored and unimpressed. They assumed this meeting was about the new city budget or a change in patrol schedules. They had no reason to think anything was wrong. "Think the captain is going to yell at us about the coffee machine again?" Kowalski whispered, nudging Rogers. Rogers smirked. "Probably. He likes to hear himself talk." The side door to the briefing room opened, and the captain walked in. He looked pale and was gripping a clipboard so hard his knuckles were white. He stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat nervously, and looked out at the room. He didn't start speaking immediately. Instead, he looked toward the back door as if waiting for someone else. Then, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open with a solid thud. The sound echoed through the silent room. Every head turned. David walked in. He wasn't wearing a police uniform. He was wearing a sharp, dark gray suit that fit him perfectly, with a crisp white shirt and a blue tie. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, the kind of silence that demands attention without asking for it. David walked down the center aisle, his shoes clicking rhythmically on the linoleum floor. He didn't look left or right. He kept his eyes fixed on the podium. As he got closer to the front row, Rogers squinted his eyes. There was something familiar about this man. The way he walked, the set of his shoulders. Rogers turned slightly in his chair to get a better look. As David passed him, their eyes met for a split second. David didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just kept walking, moving toward the front of the room like he owned the building. Rogers stared at the man's back, his mind racing. Asterisk, who is that? Then the memory hit him like a bucket of ice water. The face, slightly older, the jawline sharper, but the eyes were the same. The kid from the academy, the one they had tied to the pole. Rogers felt his stomach drop. He looked at Kowalski and Bates, whose faces had gone completely pale. They recognized him too. The rookie who had disappeared was standing in their precinct. Wearing a suit that looked more expensive than the captain's car, David stepped up to the podium. The captain stepped aside, practically shrinking away, and gestured for David to take the lead. David placed his briefcase on the wooden surface, opened it, and took out a single sheet of paper. He looked out over the room, scanning the faces of 50 officers. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "Good afternoon," David said. His voice was calm, but it carried easily to the back of the room. It wasn't a shouting voice. It was a controlling voice. "My name is David. I am the director of the newly assigned Federal Task Force for Internal Oversight." A low murmur went through the room. Asterisk Federal Task Force. Asterisk David raised a hand slightly, and the room went silent again. "I am here today because the Department of Justice has identified this precinct as a high-risk area for systemic corruption and civil rights violations. Effective immediately, this precinct is under federal supervision. I will be acting as the overseeing authority for all operations, personnel decisions, and internal investigations." He paused, letting the words sink in. He looked down at the front row. Rogers was staring straight ahead, his face frozen, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "This is not a request," David continued, his tone hardening just a fraction. "This is a mandate. We are going to audit everything. Use V-Force reports, overtime logs, evidence handling, and financial records. If it happens in this building, I will know about it." He picked up his paper and turned his attention specifically to the front row. "I want to make it clear that the good old boy days are over. I have personally reviewed the files of the senior command staff and patrol supervisors. I see a pattern of excessive force, falsified reports, and intimidation tactics that is unacceptable." David locked eyes with Rogers. It was a gaze that held years of silent determination. "Some of you in this room have treated this badge like a license to bully. You have forgotten who you serve. You have forgotten that the law applies to you too." Rogers shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wanted to stand up and shout, to demand to know what right this Fed had to come in here and talk to them like that. But he couldn't. The cold look in David's eyes stopped him. It was the look of a man who had all the cards. "I will be conducting individual interviews starting tomorrow," David said, closing his briefcase with a snap that made several officers jump. "I suggest you all go back to your desks and ensure your paperwork is in order. Dismissed." David turned and walked out of the room the same way he came in, slow, measured, and in control. The room remained frozen for a moment after the door clicked shut. Then the noise exploded. Everyone started whispering at once, looking around, wondering if they were next. Rogers stood up slowly. His legs felt shaky. He looked at Kowalski and Bates. Is that him?" Kowalski stammered, his voice trembling. "Yeah," Rogers said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's the kid." "We're dead," Bates muttered, putting his face in his hands. "He knows everything. He's the boss." Rogers stared at the empty doorway where David had exited. The humiliation he had inflicted on David years ago was coming back to him, but this time it was multiplied. He wasn't tied to a pole, but he felt trapped. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey was now the one holding the leash. Rogers realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that his career and possibly his freedom was hanging by a thread, and the man holding the scissors was the one he had tried to break. The weeks that followed the assembly were a whirlwind of activity at the precinct. David moved through the station like a quiet storm, dismantling the old culture piece by piece. He spent his days in a small glass-walled office that had been set up for him in the lobby, reviewing files and interviewing officers. He was polite but distant, professional but firm. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply asked questions that no one could answer honestly without incriminating themselves. One by one, the corrupt officers either resigned under the pressure of his investigations or were suspended pending federal charges. The captain was forced into early retirement, and new leadership was brought in from the outside. But throughout all of this, David saved the final piece of business for the three men who started it all. He knew that Rogers, Kowalski, and Bates were the heart of the problem. They were the bullies who had poisoned the well. To truly clean the precinct, he had to remove them permanently. On a Friday afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set, David sat in his office. His desk was clear, except for 3 personnel folders. He looked up at the officer stationed at his door. "Send them in," David said. A minute later, the 3 men walked in. They didn't look like the arrogant officers who had ruled the precinct a month ago. They looked like men who hadn't slept in weeks. Their uniforms were clean, but they seemed to have shrunk inside them. Rogers led the way, his head down, followed closely by Kowalski and Betts. They stood in the middle of the room, hands clasped behind their backs, trembling slightly. David stood up and walked around the desk. He leaned back against it, crossing his arms. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at them. He remembered the heat, the dust, the laughter, and the feeling of the tape cutting into his skin. He remembered the fear. He looked at Rogers and saw the same man, but without the shield of power, he looked small and pathetic. "I've finished my review of your records," David began, his voice calm and smooth. "And I've also reviewed the evidence we gathered regarding the hazing incident 5 years ago. I have the photos I took of my wrists dated and logged. I have witness statements. I have a pattern of behavior that connects that day to dozens of other cases of abuse." Rogers swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "We didn't mean anything by it," he mumbled, his voice cracking. It was just jokes. Hazing. It happens." David raised an eyebrow. "Tying a human being to a pole in the sun until his skin bleeds isn't a joke, Sergeant. It's a crime. It's assault. It's a violation of civil rights under the color of law. And with the new evidence we found in your lockers regarding the falsified reports, I have enough to send all 3 of you to federal prison for a very long time." At the word prison, Bates let out a quiet whimper. Kowalski looked at the floor, unable to meet David's eyes. The reality of their situation was crashing down on them. They had always thought they were untouchable because they wore the badge. Now, the badge was the very thing that had put them in David's crosshairs. However, David continued, letting the word hang in the air. "I am not interested in ruining lives just for the sake of revenge. I am interested in fixing this department. And frankly, the taxpayers don't need to pay for your room and board in a penitentiary." David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 3 documents. He placed them on the desk. "These are resignation agreements," David said. "If you sign them, you will immediately forfeit your pension and all benefits. You will surrender your peace officer certification, which means you will never work in law enforcement again. Not as a guard, not as a detective, nowhere. You will walk away free men, but your careers in this city are over." Rogers looked at the papers, then back at David. "And if we don't sign?" David's gaze hardened, just a fraction. "If you don't sign, I will hand this case over to the U.S. Attorney's Office on Monday morning. You will be arrested in front of your families. You will be tried, and based on the evidence, you will be convicted. You will spend the next 10 years in a cell. The choice is yours." The silence in the room was heavy. Rogers looked at the pen, then at his friends. There was no loyalty left among them. They were just 3 scared men trying to survive. There was really no choice at all. Slowly, Rogers reached out and picked up the pen. His hand shook as he scribbled his signature on the paper. He slid the folder to Kowalski, who signed it quickly, tears welling in his eyes. Then Bates did the same. David picked up the papers, placed them in his drawer, and locked it. "Your badges and weapons on the desk, please." One by one, they placed their shields and guns on the wood surface. It was the sound of their power ending. "You have 10 minutes to clear out your lockers and leave the building," David said, turning away to look out the window. "Do not say goodbye to anyone. Just go." They didn't argue. They didn't try to shake his hand. They walked out of the office with their heads down, defeated and broken. David watched them cross the parking lot from his window. He saw them get into their cars and drive away, disappearing into the traffic of the city. He stood there for a long time, watching the empty road. The knot of anger that had been tight in his chest for 5 years finally began to loosen. It wasn't gone completely, he would always carry the memory of that day, but the weight was lighter now. The precinct was safe. The bullies were gone. And the boy who had been tied to the pole had finally grown up to be the man who made sure justice was served. David turned away from the window, turned off the light in his office, and walked out the door, ready for whatever came next.